on Sunday mornings, we've been studying a series of lessons on the life of Abraham. And in our last study, which was a couple of weeks ago, in Genesis chapter 22, we journeyed with Abraham to Mount Moriah. And I guess you could say there on Mount Moriah that Abraham had a mountaintop experience with God. But life is full of mountains and valleys. You know, that's one thing about a mountaintop. You can't have a mountaintop without having a valley. And in chapter 23, we find that Abraham is deep in the valley of despair. And as we study chapter 23, the troubling times that we're going to study about concerning the life of Abraham was during the death of his wife, Sarah. And this part of Abraham's life basically gives us three principles that I'd like for us to think about regarding help during troubled times. And so let's go to Genesis chapter 23. If you have your Bibles, turn over there with me. And we're going to talk about what we can do whenever we are facing troubling times. The first thing that I'll submit unto you that we can do, and that Abraham did, is that we can let our hearts bleed. Notice in verse 1 of Genesis 23. And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. You know, all of us have been touched by the hand of death. Death can, it does, and it has taken loved ones from each one of our lives. And death is a troubling time in life. You know, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. Now, by any means, that's what we would call a very long and a very good life. But it seems like no matter how long a person lives, especially somebody who is dear to us, we're just never really ready to let them go. And so Sarah came to the point in her life where death was knocking at her door, or came knocking at her door at 127 years old. But notice the reaction of Abraham in verse 2. Abraham comes to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And I think that what we need to remember as Christians is, listen, when it comes to the biblical idea of grieving, you know, it's not uncommon for Christians, for followers of God, to grieve during troubling times. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, the Bible says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." You know, Sarah and Abraham both died not getting to see their descendants possess this land. But that didn't stop them from grieving. This is the first time in the Bible that we read about Abraham mourning. The word mourn means literally to cry out or to lament or even to wail very loudly. And then the Bible also mentions that Abraham weeps for Sarah, which means literally to shed tears. And again, I want to point out that whenever a loved one dies, you know, it's not, or it shouldn't be unnatural for us as followers of God to grieve. It shouldn't be unnatural for us to cry. It shouldn't be unnatural for us to wail or lament people's death. And in fact, when you study the Bible, what you'll find is it wasn't unnatural for followers of God to grieve during times of death. It wasn't unbiblical, but exactly the opposite is true. The majority of times that you read about believers losing loved ones in this life, you'll find that they mourn. You'll find that they cry tears. And the reason that it's not wrong for us to do such is because it shows the love that we have for the one who is departed. You might remember the story of Jesus as recorded in John chapter 11 during the death of Lazarus. And whenever he comes to the tomb of Lazarus in John 11 verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, the Word of God says that Jesus wept. You know, a lot of times we focus on that verse and we talk about the humanity of Christ, but I think we also forget about the very next verse, verse 36, which expresses this. Then said the Jews, "Behold how he loved him." You know, what did mourning show
what did crying show in the life of Christ whenever he lost a loved one? Well, it didn't show that he was emotionally weak, did it? It didn't show that he had a lack of faith. But what it did show, and what people did notice through his weeping, is how much love he had for Lazarus, who had departed this life. You know, if we love those around us like we should, then we're going to naturally grieve whenever they die. And so don't hold back that grief during times of trouble. Don't refuse to cry or to mourn, to think it's something that's unnatural or something that followers of God should not do. But let me also remind us, we need to be careful that we don't start to bathe in our sorrows. You know, in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, Paul said, "But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope." You know, the command there is not for us as Christians not to sorrow when somebody departs from this life, but the command is rather that we don't sorrow as other people, thinking that the ones who have departed this life have no hope. You know, we should grieve, we should mourn and cry, but we shouldn't wallow in our sorrow. God expects us to go on with our lives here upon this earth. God expects us not to waver from His purpose or His plans for us in this life. And so we can't allow self-pity to keep us from fulfilling God's purpose here upon earth. Yes, there is a time for us, there's a space for us to grieve, there's a time for us to sorrow over those who have departed. And that shows that we've loved them very much. We cared for them very deeply. But there's also a point that we can cross whenever we allow that self-pity to kind of overtake our lives and keep us from fulfilling God's purpose for each one of us here upon this earth. And that's what we don't want to be guilty of. And so what can we do when we're troubled? Well, we can do what Abraham did, and we can let our hearts bleed. The second thing that we need to remember, though, during troubling times is we need to behave respectfully toward other people. And I want you to note carefully in this chapter the great honor and respect that Abraham shows those around him, even though this was a very difficult time in his life. Notice beginning in verse 3 of Genesis 23. "And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth." You know, Abraham at this point in his life is, of course, a nomad within this land. That means that he literally owns no property of his own. And that creates a problem whenever you think about the death of Sarah. Here is his wife who has departed from this life. And now the question becomes, what am I going to do with her body? You know, where can I bury it in this foreign land? Because none of this land belongs to me. And even though it was a very difficult time in the life of Abraham, the way that he treated others was very respectful. You know, he didn't just march onto the scene and immediately demand of these people that they provide some land for him to bury his wife. He didn't threaten them, you know, with things saying, if you don't give me a piece of land to bury my wife, then the Jehovah God of heaven, who's been with me through all this, is going to take revenge upon you. No, he very politely and he very respectfully requests of the people of the land to purchase a place where he can bury his wife. And notice in verse 7 that he bows himself to the people of the land. You know, we have to have a badge among unbelievers. And by a badge, you know, a badge is something that identifies somebody. You can look at somebody's badge and you can determine if they're a police officer, if they're a firefighter. There are things that you can see from their badge. And as Christians, when the world looks at us, there are certain things that it should identify us with. And one of those things is the way that we treat other people. Whenever we treat other people, we need to treat them politely. and respectfully, even during this in our life. And of course, that's what Abraham does. You know, he's a person, if you notice in verse 7, that he bows down to the people of the land. Well, he's not bowing down to worship these people, but he's simply showing honor and respect for them. Paul, whenever he wrote to a young preacher, Timothy, in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 7, he says, and he's writing about the qualification of elders here, moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without. You know, we've often said, or you've probably heard people say, preachers say that the qualifications of an elder are almost the same as the qualifications for being a Christian. You know, there are few qualifications that are named of elders that doesn't have to be said of every person concerning being a Christian, but this is not one of them. You know, the idea of an elder is that he has to have a good reputation toward unbelievers. The world has to look on him in a favorable way, and they have to speak well of him also. You know, Abraham, when you think about him, what did those non-believers who surrounded him think about him? Well, he was highly respected among non-believers. And why is that the case? Well, undoubtedly, it had to be the way that he treated them. You know, if a person treats you politely and they treat you respectfully, then you have, more than likely, we're going to have a great respect. We're going to hold them in high esteem. Now, the opposite can also be true. But when you read about Abraham and the way that he treated even non-believers around him, he treated them in a very polite and respectfully way. And so he was a person who was highly respected and admired, we might even say, among non-believers. The world, as Christians, when we look out into the world today and we say, well, where are we going to get new converts from? You know, we're not going to bring new converts in from those who are already members of the Lord's church. And so if we're going to convert people to Christ, we're going to have to look outside the realm of the church. We're going to have to look into the world. And if we haven't treated unbelievers, if we haven't treated the world with respect and with being polite to them, then we're going to have a really hard time converting them to Christ. You know, and a lot of times during difficult times in our life, that's often the time that it's the hardest to deal with people, to treat people respectfully, to be polite to people. But yet you see Abraham doing that very thing. Sometimes Christians can cause hard feelings in those who are living in the world today toward unbelievers. We can have a holier-than-thou attitude. We can mistreat non-believers in such a way that it almost makes it impossible to win them to Jesus Christ. But I want you to think about Romans 5:8 and think about the idea, well, how did God win us to Christ? It wasn't through disrespect, was it? But it was through the idea of love. But God commended his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You know, we're going to have to love the world. And if we love the world, we're going to treat them in an appropriate manner. We're going to honor them. We're going to respect them. We're going to deal with them in a very polite manner. And you see that with Abraham, even during a very difficult time in his life. You think about the question, why is it that there were sinners who often flocked to Christ? And I think about a statement that was made of him in Luke 7 and verse 34. The Son of Man is come eating and drinking, and ye say, behold, a gluttonous man and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. We might say, well, people flock to Christ because they had a need, and Christ was able to provide that need for them. And that is true in a sense. But think about also, part of it was the way that he treated other people. You know, he didn't treat the publicans and he didn't treat the sinners of his day like the Jews and the scribes and the Pharisees did. And so the way that he treated them was different. And because of that, people often surrounded him and listened to what he had to say. And many were brought to Christ because of that. Abraham was going through a very difficult time here, but he still made sure that he treated the Hittites, who were unbelievers, with respect and dignity during this time. And so that's one of the things that we need to be identified with as Christians in the world today, that regardless of the situation that surrounds us, even in very difficult times, we have dignity, we have honor, we have respect toward the world itself. The second thing, under the idea of behaving respectfully, I have the point here, be bona fide with the world. And that's kind of a stretch in alliteration here, but I was running out of B words, so this was the best that I could come up with. But it's the idea of being genuine or being honest in our dealings with the world. Notice in verse 8 here of Genesis 23. And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me to Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is in the end of his field. For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for possession of a burying place amongst you. And Ephron dwelt among the children of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even of all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, Nay, my Lord, hear me. The field give I thee, and the cave that is therein I give it thee. In the presence of the sons of my people give I it thee, bury thy dead. And Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land. And he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it me, I pray thee, hear me. I will give thee money for thy field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying unto him, My Lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. And Abraham hearkened unto Ephron, and Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, current money, with the merchant. Now what's interesting about this passage is Ephron, who is again an unbeliever, just simply offers to give Abraham a piece of land where he could bury his wife Sarah. But Abraham wouldn't have any of it. In fact, if you notice in verse 9, he points out, I will give you as much money as it is worth. You know, he was going to pay Ephron the full price for whatever this land was worth. Now, the price that is named here is a certain sum involving, in verse 14, 400 shekels of silver. And you know, the shekel back then, it was a weight, it wasn't a coin. Now, later on, the shekel became 2/3, I think, of an ounce of silver. And it was actually a Jewish coin during the days of Jesus. But at this time, it was simply a weight. And so this Jewish measurement, or this weight, was put into the idea of shekels of silver. Now, it's kind of interesting when you think about, well, you know, what is that worth in terms of today? And I think when I looked up the price of silver a couple of days ago, probably changed by today, but a couple of days ago, it was worth $13 an ounce. And so if you put that into modern currency, the price that Abraham paid for this small piece of land was about $5,200. Now, we'd probably look at that today and we might say, you know, that's a steal. I'd give that for a piece of land. But back then, $5,200 was a lot of money. But yet Abraham was not going to use this time of his grief and this time of sympathy to try to take advantage of somebody else. And so it's also interesting that immediately after the price is named in verse 16, that Abraham weighs to Ephron the silver. He immediately pays him what this land is worth. And as Christians, that's one of the things that we have to be sure that we do. Not only that we pay what we owe, but we pay what we owe on time. And that's part of being bona fide with the world. That's part of being honest in the eyes of the world. In Proverbs 20 and verse 14, the wise man said, it is not, said the buyer, but when he has gone his way, then he boasted. You know, some people today brag about their ability to will and to deal whenever they're buying something. And really, when you stop and you look at their tactics, Their tactics are often nothing more than money or out of possession. They're often nothing more than being deceitful with people in order to gain an advantage over them. And that's what the wise man is describing here in verse 13. You know, here comes a person on the scene, and he's trying to buy something from somebody, and he says, well, what do you think about it? And the buyer says, well, that's nothing. You know, that thing's a piece of junk. But then he gets the price that he wants, and he pays for it, and he walks away. And when he tells somebody else about it, he says, boy, look at this great deal that I've got from somebody. Look at this bargain that I got from this man or from this woman. There's a couple things to remember. Number one, I don't think there's ever anything wrong with asking for a lower price on something. You know, if that's the price that we're willing to pay, and we simply ask somebody if they would take that for it, I don't think there'd be anything wrong with that. I don't think there'd be anything wrong with setting a price limit. You know, if you go to somebody and somebody says, well, what will you give me for this? And you might in your mind say, well, you know, the most that I would pay for this is X amount of dollars. And so you say to that person, you know, this is what I'll give you for it. This is the most that I would give you for it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's not what the Bible is talking about here. But we also have to keep in mind that we want to be careful about the impression that we make toward the world and toward non-believers. We want to be careful about how the world views us. And so what does Abraham do? Abraham agrees to pay the full price of the land. He agrees to pay whatever it's worth, and not only does he agree to do so, but he pays on time. He pays promptly. And what I want to emphasize is Abraham didn't use his grief to try to gain an advantage over somebody. He didn't try to use the idea of sympathy to take advantage of a person within the world itself. He didn't expect special favor from these people simply because one of his loved ones had died. And he didn't try to take advantage of them because he was in a time of his grief. And you know, that makes the world view us in a way where we're honest people. Abraham wasn't looking for a person to give him a deal because his wife had died. He said, I'll pay full price for the land. And he promptly paid whatever price it was that they agreed upon. And so remember that sometimes, you know, during difficult times in our lives, and especially during time of death in our life, we expect special favors from other people. We expect sympathy. We expect other people, you know, to provide opportunities for us. But remember to behave respectfully. Remember to deal with people honestly, even in difficult times. The third thing that Abraham did to help him during this troubled time was he bought into things that were eternal. Notice verse 17 here. In the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field that were in the borders round about were made sure. Unto Abraham for possession in the presence of the children of Heth before all that went in at the gate of the city. In that day there were no attorneys, there were no written contracts, and so this agreement, the Bible says, or the King James Version says in the latter part of verse 17, was made sure. That word is interesting, or the translation of it is interesting in the King James Version, because it literally means to rise or to stand. And I don't know exactly what took place, but I have an idea it was something that they did to acknowledge that this agreement had taken place, that this land had transferred hands. You know, we might liken it to a time in our country when men would shake hands to kind of seal the idea of an agreement had been made between two people. And so this agreement was made between Abraham and between Ephron. And what's interesting when you think about, why did Abraham choose to bury Sarah Hitt? You know, during this time it was the custom of people to bury their dead in their own homeland. And it's interesting that Abraham chose to bury Sarah in the land of Canaan. I think what he's doing here is he's making it clear that Canaan is his land. You know, we often talk about Abraham. We talk about him, as the Bible does, as a great man of faith, and rightfully so. but Abraham believed that this was his land. And so that's where he chose to bury Sarah. And that's where he chose to bury, for himself to be buried. And when you read about his descendants, that's the same place that they chose to be buried too. You know, Abraham was a man who believed in God's promises even after death. Like I mentioned, Sarah is buried there. Later on, Abraham is going to be buried there. Isaac is going to be buried there. Jacob is going to be buried there. And all their wives too. And what they're showing is they still believed in the promises of God, even though death had occurred within their family. You know, sometimes times of death cause people's faith to falter. They begin to become weak in the faith. But it's interesting that at the point of death, you can see the faith of Abraham is as strong as it's ever been. Even though they don't possess the land of Canaan right now, he buys a piece there, and that's where he buries Sarah. That's where he is buried, because he is considering this his homeland. Shouldn't come to a surprise to us as we read about his descendants later on, that they had some of the same kind of faith that Abraham had. In fact, in Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 24, as Joseph is nearing the end of his life, the Bible says that he said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, talking about the land of Egypt, unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham. And it's interesting to think that nearly 500 years have passed, but yet Joseph still has faith that this land that God promised to Abraham as to his descendants is one day going to be theirs. And so he made his brothers promise, when you guys leave this land, when you inherit the land that God has promised to Abraham and to his descendants, I want you to dig my bones up and take them back and bury them in the land of Canaan. Like I said, the custom of that day and age being that your bones were buried in your homeland. Well, these men and these women that we read about, they didn't stop believing in the promises of God simply because someone died. They didn't stop believing in the promises of God even when they were dying themselves. And so we need to remember to buy into things that are eternal. Keep on believing in the promises of God, even in the face of death, in the face of loved ones, and even in the face of our own death. The last thing that I'll mention under the idea of buying into things eternal, and that Abraham did and that we can do too, is keep our mind, keep our brain focused on heaven. In verse 19 it says, And after this Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And the field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for possession of a burying place by the sons of Heth. You know, Abraham finally owns a portion of land that was to be given to his descendants. And this buying this piece of real estate actually becomes a memorial in the eyes of and the minds of Abraham's descendants. They remind his descendants of the promises that God made to him. And so it causes them to think on things that are eternal. You know, in Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 9, it says about Abraham, By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles or tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. I read about Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, and I think, how could these men be so patient? How could they die in a land that's still foreign to them, having never seen the fulfillments of these promises that God made to them in their lifetime? And the answer is a very simple one, yet a very profound one, and that is that they were thinking eternally. You know, was the earthly promised land important to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? Well, sure. I mean, you read about them, that it was something that was important to them. But eternity was much more important. Heaven was the city that was really the inheritance that was on their mind. And so we need to remember, we need to keep our minds focused on heaven. Should things in this life be important to us? Well, yes. But they shouldn't be more important to us than things that are eternal in nature. And so we need to keep our brain on heavenly things. You know, life isn't going to be all about mountaintops. There are valleys that we're going to have to experience too. And sometimes those valleys of life are very troubling. Sometimes they're much deeper than they first appeared to be or we expected them to be. And what can we do during these difficult times? What can we do in these troubling times? The answer is we can do the very same thing that Abraham did. First thing that we need to remember to do is during troubling times, especially during times of death, don't be afraid to let your heart bleed. It's not ungodly. It's not unnatural. It's not showing a lack of faith for a Christian to mourn those that they love so much. It shows them that we cared for them like God wanted us to care for them. But we have to be careful that we don't start to bathe in that sorrow, that we don't cross the line wherever our self-pity keeps us from fulfilling God's purpose and plans for us and moving on in this life like He intends for us to do. The second thing that we need to do is behave respectfully. Remember to treat the people around us like they deserve to be treated. Remember to show them honor and dignity, and even in difficult times. And be honest. Deal honestly with the world around us. People will take notice of that. The third thing we need to do is remember to buy into things that are eternal. Keep on believing in God's promises even after death. Even if it's your own death that is quickly approaching. And then keep our minds, keep our brains on eternal or heavenly things. Should things in this life be important to us? Well, yes, they can be important to us, but not so important as the eternal things of life. And if we'll do all of those things, then these things will help us just like they helped Abraham